Okay, so now that we've figured out a summary and we've looked at some aesthetics of play, we've talked a little bit about player experience, let's talk more directly about developing a narrative. We'll talk about structure, plot, and the relationship of your narrative to your mechanics. So let's give some thought to how your game will express its narrative, if it has one, because games are interactive and they are not constrained to linear storytelling techniques, such as those used in books and film. So consider a few other structures. You could have a linear structure, like where the plot just goes beginning to end and it goes in order and there's no branching at all. You could have a branching or node-based structure, which we're going to look at in a few minutes. You could have a dialogue-based structure where everything progresses through dialogue. Disco Elysium is a little bit like this. You can have an open world game where players can largely complete the plot in any order, but there are maybe segments that are chained together in some way. You can have an emergent story where the game is entirely constructed randomly and through the player's actions. You can have an environmental story where the game is the story is only told through elements of the environment, and you could have something object-based where it's only told through, maybe descriptions of objects. These are not mutually exclusive examples, but they are some schemes you can use if it suits your game. So in a linear structure, the story unfolds as the player achieves goals, visits locations in a certain order, or reaches checkpoints. In this structure, the designer controls the story. The story is generally script-based. Either script is in a coding way or script is in a writing way, both. It often uses cutscenes. Some examples might be Death Stranding, Horizon Zero Dawn, or Celeste, which more or less progress in order. Even in the open world structure, there's like a main plot, like a thoroughfare there, and that has to be completed in a certain order. It's very authorial. You can have a branching structure. So branching stories create choices that lead to different storylines, consequences, or even endings. So the player has a little more choice in the story outcomes. The branching could come out in dialogue or other game-changing choices. And in this example, you have like the beginning of your story, that proceeds to a node, and that node might branch into nodes that then proceed all the way to the end. Some examples, Night in the Woods, where the story progresses in a certain way and has a set beginning and end, but the parts of it that you see are dependent on how you spend your days. Life is Strange has decision-making points that do change like later parts of the story based on what you chose, and The Witcher 2. You could have a node-based structure that is a little more complex, where the player basically chooses one way through the plot, and the plot has many, many nodes and maybe still concludes in one place, or maybe has multiple endings. But there's lots of parts of the story that your player may never see, depending on the choices that they make. And here's a simpler based example of a node-based structure. This is also called the string of pearls. So this is very common in open world games. Linear events are connected by nodes and can be completed out of order, but they do converge at points such that the overarching story progresses linearly. So the designer controls the story, but the player feels like they have a lot more control. So this is usually like quest or event oriented. Mass Effect is a great example of this. In fact, Mass Effect basically visualizes their own story structure via the star map, in that you complete like certain planets. There's points at which you can visit several planets at a time, and so you can complete those out of order, but then when you're done with those, you'll be presented with a quest objective that must be completed before you're like opened up again into Choice World. Fallout 3 works this way, and Skyrim. You could have a dialogue-based structure where the story is told through the characters. So most of the plot in these kinds of stories happens via conversation. Can be branching or linear, but this relies on really good characterization, good relationships between characters, like interesting relationships between characters, and in some cases at least, good voice acting really aids that as well. Often the player has dialogue options that allow for self-expression. And I would say a lot of like dating sim, or there are like specific genres that like really rely on this conversation structure. Disco Elysium is another really good example of that, and Stardew Valley as well. There's this open world structure where the story is mostly told through quests, like side quests even mostly. So it might have an overarching linear plot, but most of the story is from these open-ended, side stories basically. This relies on really good quest design and engaging gameplay during those quests, because the narrative can be kind of shallow for each of those quests, and normally this is helped by well-defined characters. And it's also usually the case that a narrative told in this way has a lot more world building than some other styles of games. So a lot of the quests are going to be about telling you small details about the world that maybe sometimes like add into the main story, or maybe sometimes like just sort of remain on their own. But it builds in your mind like an entire world for you that you feel like you're part of, as opposed to, just a story that you're the main character of and following. So The Witcher 3, Breath of the Wild, Red Dead Redemption 2 all follow this structure. And then there are emergent stories told through the player's experience. So in these cases, the story is not inherent to the game, but is created by the way that the player engages with the systems. So this is present in most simulation or building games. It's really great for replayability and for streaming, because the story and the drama of what you're doing is never going to be the same twice. An ideal story or playthrough should still be designed for. So you should still be creating like a golden path, or an ideal campaign or something like that, so that you know what kind of experiences you're striving for. You could create a different ideal campaign for a bunch of different kinds of players. So you could make a campaign, if you're making like, something like Civilization, for example, like a 4X game, you could design a campaign that's specifically for players that like taking over stuff, and a campaign that's specifically for players that like exploration, and one for, specifically for players that like, maybe you're doing each victory type, so specifically for people who like to win through technology and go to space or whatever it is. And then at least you have like some ideal sort of starting points. And when players play, they're gonna make lots of mistakes, they're gonna do things their own way, but hopefully they're gonna have that basis there for something to tell a good story upon. So Civilization, Minecraft, Darkest Dungeon, these are examples of games that can create emergent stories. You have environmental storytelling. So this is story via setting and senses. This story is told either partially or entirely through world building, atmosphere, and visuals or audio, like in the world. So this helps the player feel immersed and like there's a world outside of what they're doing. It's usually present in atmospheric games. Horror games do this a lot. So Journey, Metroid, Soma, Bioshock, Bloodborne all have great examples of environmental storytelling. And then object-based, so story via lore and items. This story is told partially or entirely through descriptive text or audio snippets about the world and its characters. So this helps the player feel immersed. It requires a strong sense of the world being created. So Dark Souls, Control, Bioshock, Blasphemous all have examples of this. These are, again, your sort of classic, I found an audio log or I found a book and now I'm reading something about the past that I was not involved with. Prey does a lot of this as well, actually. All right, so talking about story structure. So we've gotten 34 slides into this lecture, if you include the previous one, and we still haven't really talked about writing actual stories, huh? So I cannot really teach you that skill, and you may never need to use it. So I think it's more important that you understand how the structure and the system might work rather than details about plot. So it's more important that you get like a structural understanding, a high level understanding of how to construct a story rather than me telling you exactly how to construct your story, which I don't have any knowledge of yet. So you're going to have to be the one to figure out how to implement that structure in the end. But nevertheless, if you want to write your story structure, and I do encourage you to at least write something high level, I have some suggestions. So these examples, again, are mostly not mutually exclusive, but they can give you a starting point for thinking about designing a structured experience before worrying about the actual writing. And this does make it a little bit easier to actually begin production and chunk out parts of your game as well, if you have some kind of underlying structure to rely on. So if your game has a plot, it can be helpful to write an outline for it. The outline structure you choose kind of depends on your game and its overall narrative design. So some games may not require a plot outline, but if you are going to include one, you could include a structure of acts and scenes similar to a play or a film. You could include chapters. You might write things out in levels. You might write them in nodes, or you could write them as quests, a series of quests, or many other examples. The outline should include moments where the player or the characters make major decisions that significantly change the course of the story. So note these moments and kind of build around those. I didn't really know how to write a story when I wrote the story for Quench, and the article that is listed here, which is written by the Film Hulk, Screenwriting 101, excerpt The Myth of the Three-Act Structure is the name of the article. So it talks about how the three-act structure that you may have learned in like English class in high school really sucks and isn't that useful as a method of constructing storytelling. So this system where you are creating as many acts as are needed to determine all of the major decisions that significantly change the course of the story is a much better way to do it. But I think the article explains it better than I do. So it's worth checking out. So you can think about the major player goals and the primary conflict that challenges the player and provides friction and drama. If your game is largely emergent, you can still imagine, again, that golden path or that ideal playthrough. So what provides the drama and the interest? Why is the player coming back to play? How should a session play out? And then finally, you can talk about the relationship of your narrative and your mechanics. So how do your narrative and your gameplay fit together? Are your story and your mechanics in harmony, or are they at odds? You can probably make an argument for both, although I generally prefer them to be in harmony, personally. I think it makes for more unified design. But that's up to you and how you're planning on following or subverting your genre and your pillars, right? So does your narrative theme support your game pillars and vice versa? Are they in harmony? Are there mechanics that you can add or change that will allow the player to like interact with your theme and your thesis? If we think back to Celeste, when we were talking about Celeste pillars and themes, and how, you know, they have this pillar of mountain climbing and a theme of getting over anxiety or like coping with anxiety, and how those had a lot of synergy, and there were a lot of ways that you could like marry the mechanics and the gameplay together, or the mechanics and the story together. Try and go back and think about that. All the things that I'm trying to teach you are about how to think about game design as systems design. So when we're talking about narrative, I mostly talk about narrative systems. I don't talk about specifics, because again, I think that this is a more important skill for you to cultivate. So how are the major plot points defined in our outline negotiated in game? Like, how does it actually come to be? Do they happen to the player because the player reached a checkpoint, or does the player have a role or a choice to make in like pushing that plot along? Does their input change the outcome in some way? So do they make a choice and that branches you off into another part of the story, or does the story persist no matter what choice you make, if the player is given a choice at all? So you can answer these questions in your GDD. I don't require you to build a game where, like, there are specific narrative or specific like game mechanics tied into like every little thing that happens in the story. I don't think that's always helpful to do. Sometimes it can just simply be the player reached the end of the level and thus we played a cutscene, and in the cutscene some story happened and now things have moved along. Like it doesn't really have to get more complicated than that, but it can, and it really just depends on like what you're trying to do with your game.